Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock, we talk about whatever I want. So it's kind of a show that has no very central purpose. No, we do talk about economic and financial issues. This is not a financial planning show, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to tell you how to make your next million. If I could tell you that, I wouldn't be here. I would be spending your next million at my house. So, but instead, but I'll cut Mike in because he's a good guy and he's been loyal here all the time. Stays in, keeps me on the air, keeps me from getting into too much trouble. But no, our show's kind of an unusual thing in that we try not to get into financial planning issues. Although certainly if somebody had a question, we could talk about that. But we deal with kind of the economic and financial issues that are taking place around the country and in the world that might have an impact on you and might have an impact on some of the things that you're looking to do. And maybe sometimes we're talking about national issues. Sometimes we're talking about local issues, talking about some of the things that might happen and some of the effects that it has on you. But the main purpose is just to kind of share a little bit of information that's come across our purview and let you hear some of the things that we're hearing and talk about some of the economic issues that may have an impact on you. The good thing about economics is that it generally produces a consistent answer. It may not be the answer you want, and many people try to do the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different economic answer, which I think is what the definition of stupidity, Mike, is
insanity.
Insanity. That's it. Yeah, that's right. Definition of insanity. Trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different answer. And you don't get one no matter what, you just don't get one. You may get some interim answers that seem like you're getting a different answer, but in the long run, it's you're going to get the answer that you always get. The interesting thing about economics is that it's constantly, first of all, it's different from accounting. And my name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA, if you're new to the show. And I'm an ex-banker, so I've dealt in the world of accounting and finance and economics over the years. And the accountants and the economists always go at each other because they both say that they're both wrong. Accountants don't really report income according to the economists, and the economists, the income they report, the accountants say is made up. So it's kind of funny, but the interesting thing about economics is that it is more of a science than accounting. Accounting is more of an art form, and so a lot of the income in economics is a result of more of a consistent process. It doesn't require as much human intervention. I mean, it does require significant participation to get solid economic results, but it doesn't. But it's more like the scientific process. It's more like if you control the sample and control the study, if you have the correct number of participants, and you're studying the market as a whole, or the economic issue as a whole, you tend to be able to reproduce the results. Whereas with accounting, sometimes, depending upon which accountant's looking at it, they may have a different answer and may come up with a different result. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I always get a big kick. We've been talking this last couple of weeks about the fact that you'll hear people talk about free markets, and I heard it just recently when we were talking about I forget, it was one of the political discussions relative to some. I think it had to do with maybe had to do with Facebook and the regulation of Facebook. Yeah, and that was it. Then there was an economist on talking about whether or not Facebook should be broken up. And it's funny because that issue of Facebook has become a political issue. And it's like I said on the show here, we try not to discuss, it's not really a political show, but we do discuss politics, because politics have an impact, at least in the short run, on some of these things. A lot of economics is also involved with social behavior, movement of the masses, not even psychology as much as much as kind of a group study, not an individual study of how people, but sociology and the concept of how groups react, and society reacts in these things. And so, I think it was Mike's a history guy, but I think it was Teddy Roosevelt that was talking about the bully pulpit, wasn't it, Teddy? Yeah. And so you say, why is that? Well, because of what he was talking about, and it has that can have an economic impact. If you have somebody who's strong enough to get large blocks of people to move in one direction, it can have an impact on price. Because there are influencers. But in the short run, that's generally the case. In the long run, when people realize, when they're on the other side of the equation, when they realize that they're being impacted by it, now all of a sudden you start getting another reaction, and you'll get closer to the true reaction at that point. But politicians can, whether it's Teddy Roosevelt, whether it's Donald Trump, they can have, their rhetoric can have an impact. President Obama has certainly had a major impact on the initial implementation of the Affordable Care Act, in terms of people being willing to sign up, people being willing to accept the plan with the understanding that there was going to be a cost reduction down the road if everybody participated. So in the short run, he did impact that market pretty effectively. In the long run, because there really wasn't a decrease in costs, for whatever reason, it ended up where the market restabilized. Now, and people started trying to abandon the program, ended up getting penalties on their tax return and all kinds of things, trying to get out because the cost was greater than they can afford. So interestingly enough, the economic impact of that became apparent. And I think that from an economic standpoint, President Obama certainly had qualified economists, and they looked at it and figured with the participation, and with enough participation, enough buyers, that that we would get a lower price. We'd get a fair price, a lower price, whatever you want to call it, equilibrium in the market, because we would, the consumer, there would be more consumers buying. And so, and then ideally there's, of course, supposedly lots of sellers, and we would get a fair price, one that was fair to the sellers and fair to the consumer. But unfortunately, what happened is that the seller side fell out. There really wasn't a lot of sellers. There was fewer sellers because you had to be big enough to participate in that program. That's one of the difficulties of some of these large managed programs. They require a huge infrastructure to participate. So the mom and pop insurance company wasn't going to be an active participant on the Affordable Care Act because they just weren't big enough. They didn't have the economies. And what actually happened is it created, on the seller side, more of a monopoly. The larger insurance companies became more powerful, and some of the other participants, whether it was the consumer, even though there were now more of them, whether it was the consumer or whether it was the doctors, they lost some of their power. The hospitals were going through a consolidation, and as they consolidated, they started consolidating doctors, but they still lost some of their power. And ultimately, the main control of the program in terms of price was largely narrowed down to 4 or 5 health insurance companies that were active participants. And that really even was less in some areas. In some areas, it was only 1 or 2. And so what that meant is that the government, which should have been able to dictate that price, they thought, and control what the seller was going to sell for, which they tried to do, but they went to the sellers, these 4 insurance companies, or like I said, in some markets, 2 or 1. I mean, because the other 3 in the market were so high priced that nobody was using them anyway. So they went into that market and said, look, you need to reduce your price. And at some point it worked in the short run because that got out some competitors. But what ultimately happened is those insurance companies came back and said, we're not doing it for this price. This is our price now, and this is what we need to get. And the government looked at that, and their choice was to kick them out of the program, let them pull out of the program because it's voluntary. They didn't have to participate. Kick them out of the program, and the next thing you know, in certain markets, there's no health insurance available, or it's limited in terms of its coverage from the standpoint of it wasn't willing to cover the Affordable Care Act requirements, and it ended up shrinking the market. So we've talked about that on the health insurance side, kind of ad nauseum, but it's important to understand because the concept of health insurance and centralized health insurance is still being discussed. And certainly, as we've discussed on prior shows, health insurance has to be regulated because it is not a free market system. You can regulate it, as we've talked about, to try to get it to be more of a free market system. You can allow more insurance companies in. You can make it easier for people to get. And in fact, if people, for example, can shop private insurance companies in their local market, they might have an opportunity. The mom and pop comes in and they can actually, they may not be able to cover everybody, but they may be able to handle a certain amount of business at that level. And they may be able to provide some competition. The fact that many places insurance is controlled by the states, and they control what insurance companies can offer insurance in the state. Well, that has an impact as well. There's fewer insurance companies. So like we talked about on one of the shows, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan can't compete with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, which can't compete with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois. Those are different markets, different companies. So they're not competing with each other, even though they're all Blue Cross, which is a problem in itself. But they're still separate entities that have separate pricing, but they're not allowed in. So Michigan is not allowed into Florida to sell insurance. So, there's those kind of things that can be done to expand so that portions of the market can become more competitive. You can stop the consolidation, for example, of medical practices with hospitals. That's a definite it's a definite consolidation of power. I'm not going to call it antitrust per se, but if I was the Justice Department, I might call it antitrust. But when one company takes over some portion of the market, and it's interesting because there are different phases of a market that all of those phases have to be competitive. So let's say, for example, the health insurance market. In the health insurance market, there is the vertical market of insurance companies. They're the providers. Okay, so you've got that market, and there's all these different insurance companies, and then you've got providers within that system. You've got the drug companies. You've got the doctors. You've got the hospitals. So you've got all of these providers that are involved in the healthcare industry, including alternative providers, alternative medicine providers, and others that are out there also providing healthcare assistance. All right, nutrition and all those kind of things. So you've got different levels. So there's what they call vertical integration and horizontal integration. And vertical is where you would have the consolidation of Blue Cross Blue Shield and Aetna, for example. Well, the government would step in and probably say you can't do that. That's anti, that would be anti-competitive, and therefore we're not going to allow that consolidation. But what is going on very actively as some of these companies have got more powerful is not horizontal, that's horizontal, vertical integration, which is where you have the hospital or let's say the insurance company owning a hospital, owning a pharmaceutical company, owning a doctor's practice, so that they control it all. And so when the consumer comes in, they have only one choice: this insurance company at all of these providers. And the insurance companies aren't there completely, but one of the issues that we have in the drug industry is that some of the major insurance companies control the companies that control the distribution of pharmaceuticals. So they have a hand in the pricing. So, when you go into your pharmacist and you pay this ridiculously high price sometimes for certain medication and you're wondering why the heck, well, they're not getting reimbursed that amount. I mean, they're not getting that kind of money a lot of times. It's this exchange that controls that, and they control who can provide, who can distribute, what and how the product is distributed out of the pharmaceutical companies. And so they have control of a major portion of the players so even though they don't necessarily control the pharmaceutical companies, they do control the pricing that gets out to the consumer from the pharmaceutical companies, and then they can negotiate back. So if you've got one company that controls all of the distribution of pharmaceutical products for Blue Cross Blue Shield, let's say, and I'm just using them as an example, and let's say Blue Cross Blue Shield owns that company that's doing all of that distribution, then the pharmaceutical company all of a sudden has lost control over price because they've got one buyer they got one buyer at that point, and they've got a situation where they've got maybe a lot of potential buyers out there, but they've got somebody controlling what that buyer is willing to pay or is going to pay. And so therefore you have a limited number of buyers and multiple or less powerful sellers at that point. And so you don't get a fair price. The price could be artificially high or artificially low based on, what they're trying to do and what they're trying to, control. So you've got the same thing. We've had a number of years ago, a lot of our private doctors' practices here in Martin County and to some degree St. Lucie County, but right here in Martin County, a lot of them went away. Part of that had to do with liability insurance and lawsuits. There were surgeons in town, general surgeons, that their liability policy was running them $500,000 or $750,000 a year for their surgical practice. So they just couldn't charge enough at that point. It was just too much money. And so what they ended up doing is they went and merged in or were bought out by the hospital, which has a policy. They still have a liability policy. It's a huge liability policy. But the interesting thing is that they're kind of maxed out. They have kind of maximum exposure. So when they add a doctor's practice, a surgeon's practice, it doesn't increase their premium because they already have that risk in the hospital. So it doesn't increase their premium any. So they save $500,000. So immediately the hospital, through that consolidation, saves $500,000 because they don't have to carry as much insurance. At the same time, they can control price. They can control where the doctor. So if I own the local general practitioner, and that general practitioner is going to send me to the hospital for some tests or to something for some tests, they're not sending me to somebody else's hospital. If they're owned by, let's say, Martin Memorial, they're not going to send me to to HCA or something. So, and in fact, they can also control where those doctors can practice. They can give them hospital rights or not. So So there's all of that consolidation that can occur in a market. There's all kinds of aspects of a market that have to be looked at. Portions of it can be competitive. And if you're trying to regulate that market, because you have to, because it's anti-competitive, you can do that by controlling the market that you can't expand rapidly or change, and you can then you can try to create more competition in the area of in other areas of that system, of that hospital system or healthcare system, by, let's say, for example, not allowing hospitals to buy doctors. It's interesting because Cleveland Clinic is a hospital that was actually kind of owned by the doctors instead of the other way around. And they have a reputation for providing quality care nationwide. The reason they have that is because they're doctor focused, because they're still controlled by doctors. Now, so that's interesting. In the long run, if you had only a few hospitals controlled by by these doctors, you wouldn't have competition there either. But it's a different type of thing. In other words, instead of hospitals buying doctor practices, you've got doctor practices potentially buying hospitals. That might increase the competition because it would give the doctors a little more authority and a little more power over the distribution system and a portion of the healthcare system, which they don't control right now. But in any manner, if there's not a large number, a equal number of sellers and buyers, and that equality is not only numbers, but it's strength. Like we talked about before, you could have one buyer and one seller, and both have equal power, and you would have and you could have a free price, a fair price, if they both had the ability to negotiate. They both were powerful enough and equal enough that neither one had an advantage. What you have to be careful there is collusion. You have to make sure that because you still have potentially a third party, some other aspect of the market, another consumer, or another aspect of the market that's going to be impacted by how those prices are set. For example, in the healthcare industry, let's say you had only one doctor and only one hospital, but the doctors may be strong enough to control the one hospital. So theoretically, hospital prices, as they relate to doctors, would be fair prices. But at the same time, if you have you may have that kind of thing. But what about the consumer that now only has one choice of one doctor, one choice of one hospital? That price between if it was negotiated between the doctors and the hospitals, might be a fair price, but necessarily between the hospital and the consumer might not be a fair price. So there's a number of aspects of the whole scenario that make it very difficult. But the big point being that markets are only efficient when there is enough activity to create a fair system, a fair price system, an equilibrium system. And it requires that kind of ability to be for free movement of resources and a free enterprise type system. And it has to be efficient. The competition creates the efficiency, because if you're not efficient in a competitive market, you are out of business. You won't get any product. So it forces you, even if it's maybe not what we want, it forces you to be competitive, and it forces you to be efficient, to produce a product at the lowest possible price, or the best quality at the lowest possible price, or the best service at the lowest possible price. Because if you don't, somebody else is right next to you ready to do that at that price. because they're willing to create those efficiencies. And that's why a controlled market doesn't. There is nothing to flush out those efficiencies. When One of the difficulties with systems that are out there, hospital systems, for example, that don't face competition, or much, any local competition, in that situation, there is nobody pushing them to reduce costs. Now you say, well, I don't know. I want to be at the low cost provider. Well, you want to be at the low cost, if effective and efficient provider. And you don't want to necessarily just be at the cheapest person. But let's look at that. Look at a hospital situation. What's the chances that you're going to get, if they don't have any competition, which most of them don't? The way they're inefficient is that they would tend to buy equipment, or not buy equipment, based on their perception of what the market needs, not based on what the market actually needs. And so when they lock into that, it may preclude them from another piece of equipment, because, there is some competition. They can't get reimbursed for certain services if those services are not ordinary and customary. So now all of a sudden they're in this situation where they're going to determine, based on what they think, what they should spend, rather than the market saying, hey, we need, 10,000 CAT scans a day. So there's some need for some machines to do CAT scans. Instead, the hospital says, I think we're okay with, fewer machines for CAT scans and a lot of machines for x-rays, because we can get by with x-rays. Well, those are the kind of things that the market would determine, because if they screw that up, the market isn't going to pay for it. They're not going to pay for the x-rays when they should have CAT scans. They're just not going to do that. The insurance companies aren't going to do that, or vice versa. So it's kind of an interesting process, but it's one that, when you start looking at things, you have to look at the overall market and whether or not, it's fair, and whether there's competition in that market. So, like I said, there was some discussion this week about, which is another aspect of regulation. One aspect is to regulate price, like they're talking in the healthcare industry. The government would set the price and set what services you get. So, if you had government provided or a central provided health insurance, whether it's government or, a handful of insurance companies, whatever, they're going to determine what you're going to pay, because you have no choice. So they determine price, and they're going to determine what services you're allowed, because that affects their cost. So they're going to make determinations whether or not certain procedures are cost effective for a certain demographic. Does it make sense to do any kind of heart surgery on a 60-year-old diabetic? That kind of thing. They're going to make those kind of decisions, and what that should be. Should we do a lung transplant on a smoker who continues to smoke? Those kind of decisions would be made, because it's not cost effective. If I'm going to constantly be replacing the lung of a person who chooses to continue to smoke, and damage that lung again, then that's taking resources away from other situations, from people who, for example, need heart transplants when they really haven't done anything. They just have a bad heart. So it's a complicated process that is hard to regulate, because when you regulate, you have to make decisions, and it's you making the decisions, trying to anticipate what the consumer wants, rather than making a decision based on what the consumer wants, because they're forcing you to. They're telling you by their dollars. They're walking and going someplace else. And that um, and that, if you want them, you're going to have to give them a transplant, even though they're a smoker, or whatever the deal is, because they have other choices. Somebody else is willing to do that at some price. So, um, so that's why the centralized control of markets are so difficult, because nobody is smart enough to anticipate what consumers want. They just can't. And there's where politics comes into play. Look at the last election. If you think government people can anticipate what people are going to do, look at the 2016 election. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people missed that one, although they were 100% sure it could never happen. So that's what I'm getting at. You just don't know. Until it happens, you just don't know. In a free market system, that would have happened, and it did. Ultimately, you had an election and somebody got elected. It wasn't who everybody thought was going to get elected at the time, or it wasn't who the people who thought they were in the know thought was going to get elected, right? So because they weren't connected to that consumer, they weren't connected to that voter. And it's the same thing in the market. A lot of times, the people that are making these decisions are either from academia, or they're not out there in the trenches dealing with it every day. They've moved out of that and are in now an administrative function. So they're not in a position to really know. They're not getting enough feedback. The government never gets enough feedback, and it never comes rapidly enough. That's the problem with any kind of government control system, is that by the time the government has gotten the word, it's too late. The market has moved somewhere else. Markets are fluid and fast, particularly in healthcare. People will go and do what they need to do to get themselves. If it's a life and death situation, which it is in healthcare many times, it's funny. I, as a CPA, I do a lot of taxes, and I always tell my clients, the good thing about my job is that if I make a mistake, you don't die. You might go broke because the government will take a lot of your assets away from you, but you won't die. But that's not true in the healthcare industry. If somebody makes a mistake in the healthcare industry, you're going to die, and then they're going to take your assets away from you, because they're going to sue you. So it is a different situation. But when you get into those kind of extremes, and government is trying to dictate, people are going to be looking rapidly for choices, whether it's in the U.S. or other places. They'll be looking for choices. They'll be looking for quality of care. That's, same situation we have internationally to some degree. When somebody can't get a procedure somewhere else in the world, or can't get it when they want it or as quickly as they want it, then they tend to, go somewhere else. They'll come to the U.S. where they could get it, or someplace else that they can get it, where they can get quality care. And they do it because they have alternatives. I remember when my son was diagnosed with long QT syndrome. One of the things they were trying to do is determine what kind of to determine what variation of that long QT syndrome he had, because there were multiple variations, and depending upon the variation, the one that you had, you could have problems where when you're sleeping, you could have problems with a heart that beats too slowly. You could have a problem with with defibrillation, and something is not beating at all because it's not, the electrical system's not beating. So there was, and some of it could be caused by athletic activity, sports activity and stress, game on the line, winning field goal type thing, or it could be based on somebody just sleeping, and so it depended on and the variations depended. So for that, there was a need for a blood test, but it was an unusual type thing that, most places either didn't cover it. For example, you can't just call the insurance company and say, I need this blood test to determine what the genetic issue is with this long QT syndrome. But what you could do is, you could go to studies. You could participate in studies, because there were a number of researchers that had money to research this situation. So even though the insurance companies wouldn't pay for it to a large degree, the researchers would pay for it because they had the ability to do some of that for free. So we ended up sending his blood samples to Italy, where there were people over there researching that subject. Now, we never did get the answer, but we had an alternative. And at that point in time, and even today, but at that point in time, we would have spent whatever was necessary to find out what it was that was potentially going to kill him. So that's what you're talking about in healthcare. And that's not going to change. If I'd had to go to Italy and pay, I would have gone to Italy and paid because I didn't want my son to die. And so, that's the kind of thing that we have to deal with in that type of situation. And no central authority can determine that. Only the market can determine that. And markets do things that people think are stupid, and actually, maybe financially are stupid. Would it be stupid for me to spend thousands of dollars, to go to Italy to find out, what was going on with my son, and then potentially not get an answer? Yeah, but are there a bunch of people who would be stupid like that? Absolutely. So that's what the market's going to react to. It reacts to that type of scenario, and that's why new businesses spring up. That's why, the big thing you've heard for the last 8 years, 10 years in business is disruptive technologies. What's a disruptive technology? It's something that is so completely different in the market, so completely different that it eliminates the old system itself and replaces it with something that's completely new. What are we talking about? We're talking about Uber and Lyft. I mean, we're talking about Airbnb kind of damaging or potentially destroying the hospitality industry, the hotel industry, not the hospitality industry, but the hotel industry. We're talking about companies like Facebook that have completely changed the way that people communicate socially. How many people are out there buying pens and papers now so they write their letters to their grandma and grandpa? It ain't happening anymore. We're FaceTiming, right? Skyping or FaceTiming, or we're going in there and or we're sending a text. I mean, talk about disruptive. I wouldn't want to be a person making pens and paper right now. It's kind of not. Some of that stuff is gone by the wayside. But anyway, so but like I said, now they're talking about, with Facebook, they're talking about should we break it up, and that's one of the things in an anti-competitive market, or an antitrust situation. We all remember the old AT&T days when, and some don't. Mike, he remembers AT&T as AT&T now. He probably never. I don't even know if you were around. You weren't even around when the old AT&T got broken up, were you?
No, not the first time.
Yeah. So I mean, and it's funny what happened there. They broke up AT&T into a ton of, not a ton. I don't know. I forget how many it was, 10, 12, whatever it was, regionalized entities to create competition in the market. And, initially split between local services and long distance services, but to try to create that market. And ultimately it served its purpose, because what happened was it was initially supposed to create competition in the traditional telephone business. And it did some of that, so that some of the profits that would have gone to AT&T went to some of these regional bells. And then some of them chose wisely, and some of them chose poorly. And those that chose wisely recognized that there was these new industries that were coming in out there, like wireless technology, but that just isn't feasible. Nobody is going to have a wireless phone. That's all Star Trek stuff. Nobody's going to carry around a wireless phone that they're going to talk to people over the airwaves, and that just isn't going to happen, And never is anybody going to abandon their home phone for a phone that's not stable, that hardly ever could maybe work, and that's going to cost a fortune. That's just not going to happen. And where are we today? I mean, all of those companies morphed out of their traditional services. In effect, AT&T ended up kind of getting back some of the basic infrastructure system. But what happened is that infrastructure system is archaic and nobody's putting any money in it. And, now we have Verizon, which Verizon was one of those regional bells. We have almost all of the current wireless companies were originally one of those regional bells. But now we have these wireless companies that have become so powerful that, when you start looking at it, you've got, Verizon, and you've got AT&T, and, who else? You've got some small companies that are trying, but they've got to use AT&T and Verizon systems, towers, and things like that, for a lot of their systems, so that they have to price. Verizon and AT&T still have control over that. So it's interesting. We've seen this happen, and markets morph and they become competitive for a period of time, and then all of a sudden they don't. And they're going to, potentially reconsolidate. You got to watch that. So Facebook, breaking up Facebook, I don't know what you break it up into. I guess you'd break it up into Facebook Business, and then Facebook Social, and then Facebook Elections, and then I don't know. I don't know what you'd break it up into. What do you break a Twitter up into? I don't. I don't know. I mean, but and then do you already have, at least on the social side, do you already have competition for some of Facebook's product? What about Instagram? What about Snapchat? What about some of those that are out there that are trying to compete on that side? I don't know, but the market, especially in the technology area, the market is constantly changing. If I said to, I always pick on Mike because he's way younger than me. So Mike, how often do you email every day?
Every day.
Yeah, you email pretty much every day, right?
Every day, yeah.
How much do you text?
Every day.
Yeah. Probably almost every hour. Text?
Depends. It could be several times an hour. Yeah.
And so, what about Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter?
I am not as up with what's cool on things like Instagram and Snapchat, so I don't personally use those. I'm on Twitter, I would say a couple of times a day.
Yep. And how often are you on the phone, on your phone, your cell phone? Don't count the calls here in the office.
Okay.
But how much time do you think you spend on your cell phone versus the amount of time in a day that you spend on all those other things combined? Emails, text, any of the.
You mean actually making phone calls?
Yeah, actually making and talking on the phone.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of days where I don't make an actual phone call.
And that's amazing. I can't remember. I mean, when I was a kid, if mom and dad took my phone away when I was in high school, that was a big deal. I couldn't talk to anybody. I was isolated. That was cruel and unusual punishment. And today, young people voluntarily choose not to speak to each other on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
They do all kinds of other things. I mean, when you look at what some of the social media has done, that's why it certainly is interesting to take a look at some of this stuff, because when you look at the impact, for example, that social media has had on on teenagers and tweens as it relates to bullying. I mean, we've talked before, Mike, about like when I was a kid, a bully actually came up and punched you, and that wasn't a bad thing because you punched him back and stood your ground eventually. And it didn't have any long-term impact other than a broken nose, maybe, or a bruised eye, and everybody's all worried about that. But those all heal and they go away. And other than when you're 65 and you start talking about, well, I remember when I was 12 and I got in that fight and the kid broke my nose. That's the last time you ever talk about or even see it about that broken nose. Nobody really even knows. You got it fixed and you're done. But I guess this social media is like plastic. Once it gets out in the environment, it's kind of there forever, right? It never goes away. It's just one big cesspool someplace that's floating around that people can activate and get into and figure out find out all kinds of stuff about you. I mean, I feel sorry for people that grew up in this technology age as it was developing, because just like when I was a kid, I couldn't imagine not having a phone. And ability to have a phone. And yet before me, my parents were lucky to have a phone. They had a party line, most likely, if they had anything, but they were lucky to have a phone. And, and a lot of people couldn't afford that service. It was for people that had a lot of money. You went to a pay phone from time to time, so all of that stuff. And then, but the young people today, they grew up in this environment where, you could actually post pictures to cyberspace. You can say things that can come back to haunt you because you were 12 or 14 or 16, or because it was taken out of context. How many times have you read something from somebody? And I know I hate social media from the standpoint of I'm very sarcastic, just fun sarcastic. I'm usually picking on myself more than anybody else, but people know I'm not doing it maliciously. It's just fun. I just comment, and I like to tease myself. I like to be teased. I don't mind. When you're a overweight bald guy and you've been that way all your life, you kind of get used to being teased. So I'm okay with picking on myself. Usually I take the first shot because I take probably less of a shot than maybe the other guy might take. So I'm okay with that. But I'm just saying that I think about some of that, but some of the things that happened to me when I was a kid, or that I responded to when I was a kid, that's not out there in the world for the world to see. But the young people today, and even, not that much younger than me, say 20 years younger than me, in the 40s, they are out there with it all to see. It's all there someplace that somebody probably can drum up and find, and they can then play a news clip. I was, and this is not a political comment. This is a comment. I saw this morning they were talking about President Trump's tweet about impeachment and lynching. Did you see that, Mike?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Right. Now, so he's making a comment, basically just a general comment. It wasn't meant as any kind of a racial slur, but he was making a general comment that lynching is a bad thing, and that impeachment, the way it's being done right now, was basically the equivalent of a lynching type situation. Okay, so everybody got up in the arms because he used a term, lynching, which everybody gets crazy now. Everything's got to be politically correct. But the funny thing was, Joe Biden, he immediately criticized President Trump for making that comment and how disgusting and disgraceful that was. And within an hour, they had a clip of him saying the exact same thing. And I'm thinking, how unfortunate. He didn't think about that. He doesn't remember making that comment during the Clinton impeachment. And he made it almost verbatim the way that Trump tweeted it. But it's instantaneously there. You can't go from, so then he's got to come out and apologize and say, well, that was live TV and it was a bad decision. I'm sorry. But, the problem is everything you do, good and bad decisions, are out there for the public to see. And it's so horrible. So should Facebook, should some of these things be, controlled? Probably, especially since, a company like Facebook is using a lot of this information to create demographics to try to target certain groups of people. So, and they have a lot of power because they control a lot of things, just like Amazon controls a lot of things. So anyway, it's interesting economically. We always want to talk about free market systems, and we all want free market systems, but we have to recognize when they don't exist, because it's very important to understand when you won't have a fair price, because you can bang your head against the wall all you want. You're not going to get a fair price. Anyway, join us every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock, or don't, right here on WSTU. We are Digital 1450, and we are Martin County's very, 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 very old station.